challenges of constructing a South American citizenship based on the EU's experience, particularly the EU's freedom of movement, I suppose, which is one of the four fundamental freedoms that EU citizens have, right? That we could, in theory, move around all over. So that's going to be truly a hot, interesting topic. Dr. Acosta, he has been a lecturer in European law and the deputy director for the impact at the University of Bristol in the UK. He's the university's ambassador for Colombia and holds a PhD in European law. Is regularly invited to present his work at many international conferences, and he has published widely. Amongst other, he was the author on the European migration law. He's published author in European migration law, and he wrote the long-term resident status as a subsidiary form of EU citizenship. Maybe you can help us a little figure out what exactly that means for non-lawyers.
No way.
But he's also published in major European and EU reviews such as the Journal of Common Market Study or the European Law Journal. So as such, it's my pleasure to welcome you. Thank you very much. And it's time to go.
Well, thank you, Marcus. And I need to speak like this, right? So, okay. Well, thank you, Marcus. I thank you, Christine, for the invitation to come to Miami. It's always a pleasure to be here because I was a student here in 2003, 2004. So I was at FIU. So it's always quite nice to be back. I'd like to ask you also if anyone here is South American. I mean, I know Juan Camilo is from Colombia. You are from where? Colombia as well. Any other South American? No. And then we have a few Europeans. We have Christine, Marcus, myself, European. And the rest of you guys, you are from the US, or where are you from? US? No? Where about? Dominican Republic. Okay, so what I'm going to be discussing doesn't apply to the Dominican Republic yet, although it might apply in the future, okay? So basically what I'm going to be talking about is this idea of a South American citizenship, and I'm going to explain briefly in the next 15-20 minutes how this is evolving, and also I'd like to tell you a little bit why this idea of a South American citizenship is important and why it's important to look at South America as a region of migration and as a region of mobility, of free movement. And the reason for that, well, there are many reasons for that. The first one is that there is very little research on South America and on immigration in South America, and that is a problem for those of us who are interested on migration, because obviously in the end we only have work on the US and on Europe, so we don't see at other regions in the world where we have a lot of immigration and migration flows as well, and that limits our understanding of migration in general. The second reason why it's important to look at South America from a European perspective particularly is that we have a special partnership with South America. The European Union has a special partnership with South America. Migration is one of the most important topics in that special partnership, but it was always about migrants coming from South America into Europe. In the last 5 years, that has changed to a certain extent. There are less migrants from South America coming into Europe, and there are now Europeans going to South America, migrating to South America, especially Spaniards and Portuguese. And it's very interesting because I was doing a consultancy for the Brazilian government. We were working with sociologists, and we asked a group of Spaniards and Portuguese in Rio and Sao Paulo who had arrived in Brazil since 2008. And 35% of those people that we interviewed, they were in an irregular situation. So they were what you call illegal migrants from Europe in Brazil. So that obviously changes the whole relationship and the whole discussion on migration between both regions. Then I think to look at South America is also very important, because South America and the idea of constructing a South American citizenship is part of a global wider trend of what we call post-national forms of membership. What do I mean by that? I mean that nowadays in many regions you don't need to be a citizen any longer in order to have almost equal access to rights, and that the clearest example of that is obviously the European Union, the European citizenship. I am a Spanish national, but I have the right to reside and work in the UK. It's not the UK giving me that right, it's my individual right to move to the UK and work there. I could move tomorrow to France, to Germany, to Poland, and that wouldn't make any difference either, okay? So this is what we call post-national forms of membership. So I think the developments in South America are also part of that debate. So with that in mind, let me begin by showing you a nice sentence, and I'm going to ask you who wrote this sentence. So we just read it together. The human right to migration and the recognition of migrants as subjects of law must be at the center of a state's migration policies. In line with this, we claim the unconditional respect of the human rights of migrants and their families. We condemn all xenophobic, discriminatory, and racist acts, as well as utilitarian treatment of migrants, and we reject any attempt to criminalize irregular migration. So if I may ask you, who wrote that? Was it someone in the US? Was it an NGO? Was it an academic who's very much in favor of migration? Who do you think wrote this sentence? This sentence obviously is very, very nice on migration, right? It's a very positive sentence about migration. Who do you guys think wrote this? No clue? Any guess? No?
Well, either the EU or the OAS.
The OAS, okay. Well, it was actually the South American Conference on Migration. The South American Conference on Migration is represented, the 12 governments in South America are represented in that conference. It's a regional consultative process, and they meet once per year, and they discuss how migration should be regulated in South America, okay? So this is from the South American Conference on Migration. This is a declaration that is called the Buenos Aires Declaration from 2013, and it was the common position that these 12 countries had on migration. Okay, so as you see, a very, very positive and liberal discourse on migration, which is completely different from the one we have, for example, in most countries in the European Union nowadays, right? What are the main pillars of this positive discourse on migration, of this very open discourse on migration, and how is it possible that this discourse has reached this level of openness in South America? So it is very interesting to see how that has happened, because that was not the case before in South America. During the 70s and the 80s, there were many military dictatorships in many countries in South America. Most immigration laws were adopted during that period, and the discourse on migrants was really restrictive and really harsh. Migrants were looked at with suspicion and basically as enemies. That continued during the 90s, even though the military dictatorships ended in most countries in South America, but that harsh discourse on migration continued during the 90s, and it was only at the turn of the century that we had this new, very liberal discourse on migration. Why that happened? Well, I think it changes from country to country, obviously, but there are 3 or 4 main reasons which are applicable to all the countries in the region. The first one is that there was a lot of emigration at the turn of the century. So many South Americans, for example, from Argentina, from Ecuador, from Brazil, migrated at the turn of the century because of economic and political crisis in the region. That had been ongoing for a couple of decades, but that was accentuated during the first years of the century, right? So a lot of people left. Basically, they left to Spain and to the US. And the countries, the governments in these countries, they started realizing about the way in which migrants were being treated, notably in Spain and in the US. There were a few reactions to that, and that was seen as a window of opportunity also for civil society groups in South America to start saying, well, wait a minute, we're criticizing the way our migrants are being treated in Europe or in the US, but how is that we are treating ourselves, the migrants from the neighboring countries? So that was a window of opportunity for these civil society groups to enter into the debate and to put pressure on the governments to change also the discourse, and in turn to change also the legislation in these countries. So there was this critiques of the EU and the US, there was this need of coherence, and another very important aspect was this idea of regional integration. So at the turn of the century, Mercosur had also a crisis, and the same way in which we have done in Europe many times, we always ask this question, how can we make the European Union more attractive to citizens? How can we make it closer to citizens? And when we introduced European citizenship in the European Union in '93, that was also the main idea, to bring Europe closer to the citizens, to make Europe meaningful for citizens. So that was also part of the discourse. There were debates about making regional integration more meaningful for citizens, and that is when a particular agreement that I'm going to discuss in a second, the Mercosur Residence Agreement, was adopted in 2002. It only entered into force in 2009, but I'll explain that in a second. As I said, what are the main pillars of this very liberal discourse that has been ongoing in South America for the last 15 years on migration? The main pillars is the right to migrate as a human right. That is now part of 4 legislations in South America, of the Ecuadorian Constitution, the Argentinian, Uruguayan, and Bolivian immigration laws, which are new, are quite recent. Nobody really knows yet what is meant by this right to migrate as a human right. Non-criminalization of migration, defense of the rights of migrants, including irregular migrants, and the importance of opening borders in order to deepen regional integration. So those are the main pillars of this liberal discourse. And obviously I am a lawyer, I am not a political scientist, so I am interested in seeing how this very liberal discourse is being translated into legislation, because otherwise we will have a gap between the discourse, which is very open, and the reality of the legislation, which is still closed, because it's coming from, as I explained earlier, from the immigration laws we were adopted during the military dictatorships in the 70s and the 80s. So what we have is that the picture is quite mixed. We have certain countries which have changed their immigration laws, and they have now some of the most open and liberal immigration laws in the world, like for example Argentina or Uruguay. But we have other countries which are still finding it very difficult to change their immigration laws. For example, Brazil, they have been for the last pretty much 15 years trying to change their immigration law, and they haven't been able yet. And nowadays we have 4 proposals for a new immigration law, which is quite unique. I cannot think of a country having 4 proposals for a particular new law in an area. We have this idea of the Mercosur Residence Agreement, or this agreement that I'm going to explain in a second. And we also have proposals for South American citizenship, which is quite interesting, but which no one really knows yet what is going to mean. Who is going to be included in the South American citizenship? What are going to be the rights that you're going to get as a South American national, etc. So it's very early stages as well. Okay, so this is the national level, as I said. But I'm most interested today in South American citizenship, and in seeing how this is taking shape in the debates in different regional organizations in South America. Because that is the first problem. In South America, we have at least 5 different regional organizations discussing about South American citizenship. And that in itself is quite a problem, because it doesn't bring coherence, because it's not very clear who is leading that process, etc. In Europe, we only had 1 regional organization discussing free movement or EU citizenship, which was the European Union. And the ownership of that process was very clear in the hands of the European Union. In South America, as you can see, we have on the one hand the Mercosur. Mercosur only includes Venezuela, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina as full members, but all the other 7 members, all the other 7 countries in South America are also associate members of the Mercosur, which means that any agreement that the Mercosur achieves can be applicable to all the countries in South America. So for example, Colombia is not part of the Mercosur, but that doesn't mean that the Mercosur Residence Agreement also applies to Colombia, because they are an associate member. So they can also ratify that international treaty. UNASUR includes all the countries in South America, and as you can see in the founding treaty in Article 3, they talk about the consolidation of South American identity to the progressive recognition of rights aiming at South American citizenship. But so far, there are no proposals coming from UNASUR on how to build this South American citizenship. Then we have the Andean Community, which is a very old regional organization coming from the 1969, which includes only Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru. And they also have had discussions about creating an Andean citizenship and also contributing to a South American citizenship. We now have a new organization which is called the Pacific Alliance, which only includes Chile, Colombia, Peru, but also Mexico, so outside of South America. And they're also discussing this objective to move progressively toward the free circulation of people. And the Pacific Alliance is also interesting because Panama and Costa Rica are now looking into joining also the Pacific Alliance. So that will mean that not only Mexico will be from outside the region, but also Panama and Costa Rica. And then, as I said earlier, we have this South American Conference on Migration, which is this regional consultative process which has no binding declarations. Okay, so this is simply in order to reach consensus and to put certain issues on the agenda. So what is the picture that emerges from all this, and what is the most important agreement that we have so far, and the one that is to a certain extent, working. Well, that one is the Mercosur residence agreement. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard about it, or if you knew that now a Brazilian can move to Argentina to work, a Colombian can move to Peru to work, etc., etc., etc. So basically what this agreement is doing is free borders, open borders in South America. It applies to all countries in South America except for Venezuela, Suriname, and Guyana. Venezuela has to ratify it for sure because it's part of the Mercosur. Suriname and Guyana, they may decide to do it or not, okay? But all the other countries in South America now, they have this Mercosur residence agreement, which means, as I said, that a Chilean can move to Argentina, an Argentinian can move to Bolivia, etc. How does this agreement work? Well, basically, you can move for up to 2 years. That is a temporary residence permit. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to prove that you're a worker. You don't have to prove that you have sufficient resources. That is completely different from the European Union. In the European Union, you can only move if you are either a worker or self-employed, or if you are not a worker or self-employed, you need to have sufficient resources and a sickness insurance in order to move. So if I want to move tomorrow to Berlin and be in Berlin for the rest of my life without working, that is fine, as long as I have sufficient resources and a sickness insurance. This agreement here is completely different, because in order to be 2 years in another country, you don't need to prove sufficient resources. You simply need to prove that you are a national of one of the South American countries and that you have a clean criminal record. That is the only thing you need to prove. That idea of having a clean criminal record is also different in Europe, because in Europe the burden of the proof to prove that you're a threat to public policy or public security is on the state. In South America, you need to prove that you're not a threat to the state. So the burden of the proof is turned upside down. And then you enjoyed a number of rights under Articles 8 and 9, the right to work, the right to family reunification, rights of socioeconomic character as well. But it's not very clear how these rights are working in practice, because this is an international agreement which is being implemented differently in each country in South America. So what are the main differences with the European Union, and why it's important to look at those differences? Well, it's obviously important to look at those differences because in the European Union we have a long history of creating free movement and of establishing a European citizenship. This whole process began in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome, and it continued in the 60s when we had in Europe only free movement for workers. Then in the 70s we extended that free movement also to the self-employed, and it was only in the 90s that we had free movement also for citizens, for those who were non-economically active, and for students. So we have a long history, and the most important aspect of that long history is that the main actor in pushing towards European citizenship has been the Court of Justice of the European Union. So for those of you who are not aware of how the European Union works, basically we have a Court of Justice which is the supreme interpreter of European law. So they have the final word on the meaning of European law. And that Court of Justice has been really the main motor, the main engine behind European citizenship. And they are the ones that have pushed this concept much farther. There is no similar court in Mercosur, so this is going to be a problem. Because what happens when you don't know how to interpret a particular concept? It's going to be up to the national courts to interpret that concept, which means that each country will have a different interpretation, unless they agree together afterwards. And the other difference with the European Union is that in Mercosur there is no commission. The European Commission, again, for those of you who don't know very well how the European Union functions, basically the European Commission, whenever there is a breach in the implementation of European law in a country, the European Commission can launch an infringement procedure, and basically they can force that country to implement correctly European law. That doesn't happen in Mercosur. There is no Mercosur Commission. There is no supranational institution looking for breaches of Mercosur law. So that is completely different. So that is the main problems. The other ones, the other differences, well, here I have a few. As I have said, you don't need sufficient resources. The burden of the proof to have a clean criminal record falls on the individual in South America. That is not the case in Europe. Also in South America, the countries can impose fees. When they are moving to another country, they can impose you a fee to get the residence permit. That is not the case in Europe. For example, now Ecuador implemented the agreement, but they are asking $250 to get the residence permit, which is quite a lot of money. In Europe, that is not possible. you cannot impose such a high fee in order to get this temporary residence permit. So there are a few differences between South America and the European Union. We are going to be discussing, for example, these differences with the Argentinian government. We are organizing a conference in Buenos Aires in May with the Argentinian government as part of this project in which I am working, this Migprosp project. And we're going to bring scholars and the European Commission, scholars from Europe and the European Commission, together with the Argentinian government, Migprosp, and scholars from South America, to start discussing these ideas and to start seeing how some of the challenges that Europe has faced over the last decades could be replicated or could be successfully solved in South America. So do we have a real paradigm shift in South America? We have said we have a very liberal discourse, but we have seen that the reality of the legislation on the ground is taking longer to take shape and to change. Well, I find this idea of governance as being very useful to discuss anything, to discuss migration in particular, but to discuss any other process. And what I understand by governance is that governance is 4 steps. So the first one will be agenda setting, and obviously there are many actors which can set the agenda on a particular issue. Then we will have consensus building, which is seeing how we're going to deal with a particular issue, reaching a consensus on how to deal with a particular issue. Then we have legislation and policies, obviously, which is the 3rd step. And then we have the implementation and the interpretation of that legislation and of those policies. So it's very clear that in South America, migration and free movement of people at regional level has been put into the agenda. That is the first step. And it's very clear that there is a consensus on how to deal with this free movement in South America. That is the second step. The third one, which is the legislation and the policies, is still taking shape. So this might be a matter of time, obviously. It might be a matter of a few more years, as it happened in Europe. As I said, in Europe we began in 1957, and nowadays we still have problems in the interpretation of free movement of citizens. And this is a contentious issue in many countries. For example, where I live in the UK, it's a really contentious issue at the moment. We have national elections in May. We have a new party in the UK, which is UKIP. You may have heard about them. And basically their main program is against European Union and against free movement of people in the European Union. That is their main ideas. So this is still something that is controversial in Europe, and that it goes back and forth. Okay, so it might be a matter of time. And obviously the process of regional integration, as I explained earlier, it will depend a lot on who takes ownership of this regional integration process. Is it going to be the Mercosur? Is it going to be UNASUR? Who is going to take ownership of this process? That will be very important to see whether South American citizenship becomes a reality or not. So conclusions, there has been a very clear shift in the discourse in South America. That in itself is very interesting. As I said, South America has the most liberal discourse on migration in the world at the moment. I think discourse is very important, and we have seen that in Europe. For example, in Europe we have always had a very clear division between, on the one hand, those who were irregular migrants, or otherwise known sometimes as illegal migrants, and there was always a very clear idea on the fight against illegal migration. And then we always divided between irregular migrants and then legal migrants, asylum seekers, and European citizens. And that idea of having a very tough and harsh discourse on irregular migrants and having a more liberal discourse on legal migrants, asylum seekers, or European citizens, that whole idea has backfired, in my view. And that is very clear from the European Parliament elections last year in Europe, because many parties who were basically their main proposals were to reduce free movement of people in Europe, they gain a lot of votes. Because it's very difficult for the normal citizen to distinguish between an irregular migrant and a European citizen. And that also is something that changes overnight. So Croatia joined the European Union on the 1st of July 2013. On the 30th of June 2013, Croatian nationals could be potentially irregular migrants in any other country of the European Union. So let's take the example of a plumber working in Berlin, being Croatian, and perhaps he was in an irregular situation. in Germany on the 30th of June 2013. The day after, he was an European citizen with equal rights who was simply exercising his right to self-employment in Germany working as a plumber. So this changes all the time. Okay? This also changes, for example, if you get married, if you divorce, etc. So these are processes that are changing all the time, and therefore, if you have a harsh discourse on, for example, irregular migration, you run the risk that that discourse also spreads to other areas, including European citizens. So I think this course is very important. As I said, there has been a clear shift in agenda setting and consensus building also in Latin America. There are very important steps on law and policies. We have new legislations which are very avant-garde. So that is also very important, especially the immigration law in Argentina. There are difficulties in implementation. And the future, well, we don't know what is going to happen in the future. We have had 15 years of continuous openness. Will that continue in the next 15 years or not? Well, that is a matter to be seen in the coming years and in the coming decades. So thank you very much. And I wait for your questions or...
So, anyone questions?
What will be the role of the Pacific Alliance between Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Colombia, Chile, and Peru?
Yep.
Regarding this immigration and process, and how will, how the MILA, the integrated market of Latin America, will play a role in...
Yeah, do I still need to keep on talking here? Yeah, okay. So the Pacific Alliance is very interesting because it's a very new organization. And they also have, in the founding treaty, the willingness to move towards the free movement of people between the countries which are part of the Pacific Alliance. It's very interesting because it includes Mexico, which is outside, obviously, South America, but also Panama and Costa Rica are willing to join. So that will include also countries in Central America. The only thing that they have done so far is to start getting rid of visas between the countries, especially for business movement between the countries, or for business people doing business between the countries. But they also have something that is very interesting, which is that they have now, let me tell you where it is actually. I think it's in Ghana. They have a common embassy or a common consulate from all the 4 countries in Ghana. And that is very interesting because one of the key aspects of being a European citizen is that you can go to another country in the world, and if you don't have, for example, I am Spanish, I go anywhere in the world, if there is no Spanish consulate, it doesn't matter because I can go to the British one, to the German, anywhere, right? The Polish one, doesn't matter. And they are obliged to treat me, to receive me, and to give me consular protection. And that is why I find this idea of having common embassies or common consulates from these 4 countries so interesting. That is one of the elements of citizenship, right? That could be there. So it's difficult to know what is going to happen. As I said, one of the main problems for me is that there are 4 different regional organizations playing a role. You have Mercosur, Andean Community, UNASUR, and now you have the Pacific Alliance. And then on top of that, you have other regional processes also playing a role, like the South American Conference on Migration. So it's difficult to know who is going to take ownership. The most developed agreement so far is the Mercosur agreement, the Mercosur Residence Agreement. But that also has problems, as I said, for example, not being a court of justice of the Mercosur to be able to interpret this agreement, etc. So the Pacific Alliance is a very interesting new development, right? Yes.
About the company business when they go with Mercosur or so the taxes, where are they going to pay their taxes? In the country of residence, and that's where in Europe?
Well, you will pay the taxes in the country where you live for longer than 183 days per year. So that will be, that is sometimes a problem also in Europe, but in principle, that is the general rule everywhere in the world. I'm not an expert in tax law, but that's the general rule. Wherever you live for 183 days or longer, that's where you pay your taxes. If you don't live anywhere for 183 days, you have to pay your taxes where you have your main economic activity.
You have to declare in Europe too, is that correct?
No, you will only have to declare in the country where you're residing in Europe. So for example, myself, I don't pay taxes in Spain, I pay taxes in the UK. That sometimes is a problem when you start moving, especially in the beginning, because it's not very clear, you need to have to do some paperwork, but that's the rule, yeah.
I have actually two questions for you. One is, the first one is about the future, the realization of the future potential of that agreement, right? I mean, we know in Europe, fairly wealthy region, only 3% roughly, right, of European citizens move actually to another country, labor mobility. So now in Latin America, I've been there a couple of times, and you certainly know that as well. Labor mobility, it sounds good, but it's not that easy realizable with, in developing countries, right? So that's the first question. How, what actual progress would that, or how would it help the ordinary citizens there in the region? And the second is, we've seen, as you know, in Europe recently, attempts to kind of actually curtail and limit the freedom of movement, right? Partly based on security issues, after Charlie Hebdo and all this stuff, but partially also because during the Euro crisis, people didn't want to, like the Polish movement, right, the corporations that were moving from new member states to the old member states were supposedly taking jobs away. So there were these attempts in Europe. What would happen? I mean, is there something like do these policymakers also expect these unintended consequences of free movement of labor in Latin America, right? Let's say Argentina, as you know, is going down the drain economically, and Brazil may be taking off. So what will Brazil do with the open labor movement if half of Argentina suddenly ends up in the country?
Well, those are two very important questions. I think the fact that in Europe we have free movement, open borders. There are no borders in Europe. There is only 3% of the population moving. Despite the inequalities in salaries, in differences in salaries, differences in unemployment rates, differences in access to welfare benefits, and despite all that, only 3% of the population in Europe moves, which means that people in general, despite what the media may show, people in general do not migrate. People stay where they are from, right? And that is interesting, naturally, is 3%, because that is the same percentage at global level, where we obviously don't have open borders, but still is the same 3% moving. 97% of the world population stays where they are from, right? Regarding that, I remember a couple of years I was in Brasilia, and there was the Secretary of State for Migration at the table, and we were with some civil servants from the Ministry of Labor, and he started his presentation, and he said, well, there are 600,000 Brazilians in the other South American countries, and there are 600,000 South Americans in Brazil, so this goes both ways, we all benefit from this, and this is great. Imagine David Cameron in the UK saying the same, when it's actually true. There are 2 million, more or less, European nationals in the UK, but there are 2 million Brits in the other 27 member states. Of course, UKIP, or in this case the Tories, or even the Liberals or the Labour Party, they never mention the Brits who are in other countries, okay? So obviously that can change. One day they can start realizing only about the ones that they have in their own country rather than about their own nationals who are in the different countries, okay? But so far the discourse has been quite relaxed in that direction. Obviously, migrations are cyclical, so as we have seen in Spain was the country that received the largest number of European citizens for a decade. We have in Spain 2.5 million European citizens in Spain, and for a long period we were very few Spaniards in the rest of the European Union, only 300,000. Now in the last 5 years with the economic crisis, there are less Europeans coming to Spain, and there are more Spaniards going to the other 27 member states, okay? So this is cyclical. The same happens in South America. When Chile ratified the Mercosur residence agreement in 2002, they were Ricardo Lagos. When he did that, he was thinking about the Chileans in Argentina. Obviously, when the agreement has entered into force, there are more South Americans going into Chile because Chile has done well economically. So obviously, I think the important thing there is to have a relaxed debate in the sense of showing, well, this is cyclical, there will be moments when you will have more people coming in, more people leaving, but this is never going to be a constant trend, not even for the Polish going to the UK. Obviously, as Poland improved economically, many Polish went back to Poland, and even other Europeans started moving to Poland to a lesser extent, right? So So I think that is a very important point there. And your second question was, I have forgotten now.
You touched upon it in terms of what will happen, for example, in Chile, right? How did the government deal with the sudden influx of Argentinians after they entered into the...
Okay, yeah. Well,
But it seems like they have a very relaxed attitude.
So far, yes. Of course, it changes from government to government. With the Piñera government, but Chile had a slightly harsher discourse on free movement as well. And now that, again, Bachelet is in government, the manifesto of the party was quite also open towards regional integration and all that. And so it might change also depending on the party in power in the particular country. But yeah, so far it has been quite relaxed, I would say, in that regard. It might change, of course, yes.
Do you think with this question, the fact that in Latin America, a lot of the countries speak language will have a different impact than in Europe, where a college needs to know French in order to move?
Yeah. Well, you don't really need to know French in order to move. I mean, a lot of people live in Amsterdam or in Stockholm or in Brussels or, speaking in English. And so
that's already a second language in addition to college.
Okay, well, yeah, or if you were British, let's say, and you will move to, or Irish, and you will move to Brussels, you can be there the rest of your life without speaking French or Flemish, and you can still move, reside there and live there. Obviously, the common language could be an advantage for a lot of people. But one point that relates to both your questions is that the agreement is not very well known yet for the citizens. So that is another important point. Actually, when I talk with a lot of South Americans, they tell me, well, I didn't have a clue about this. That I could move, actually, that I had the right to move to other countries. I didn't know about it. Because it's quite recent, and also it's not that developed yet. So obviously the common language is very useful in that regard for people to move around the region, certainly, yes.
I have another question. What do you think is the impact on education, given that some of the countries have free education and others don't?
Yeah. So that's another very interesting point. In principle, when you move as a Mercosur under the Mercosur agreement, you could study. Because you're not requested to prove resources or to be working. So for the first 2 years you could be studying. Then after 2 years, in order to stay permanently in the country, you need to prove that you have sufficient resources. Okay, so after 2 years you need to prove that you have sufficient resources. There are, for example, many Colombians going to Argentina to study. That is a trend that has happened not only now but also in the past, right? And also because Argentinian universities were quite good, and as you said, because they are free, and compared to many private universities in other countries, there's a big difference there. But that is one of the things that since not so many students have moved so far, for example in Europe, free movement of students has been a constant subject of litigation before the Court of Justice of the European Union for many different reasons, okay? And there are many cases, there are around 50 cases dealing only with the students in Europe. What is going to happen once more students start moving around in South America, how their rights under the agreement are going to work is difficult to foresee. But it's a very important point, certainly.
Are there something about the same that is said in Europe, like the TT?
Say again, sorry?
TTIP? Are there something, well, we are working on Europe and the United States for business and for currencies and things. Are there something about Latin America and Europe with working on a contract like TT?
Free trade agreement. Well, there have been many. I'm not an expert on free trade. There were many discussions for many years with Mercosur and the European Union, but it was not ratified in the end, right? It was not ratified, right? And there is one free trade agreement with Chile, I think, the European Union and Chile. So that has been on the table, certainly. That has been there. But these agreements, in terms of mobility, are useful only for the elimination of visas for certain categories of people, but not for the wider picture of citizens moving. Yeah.
Well, did you look? I know this is not really your comparison, but I know that you're working in this larger research project on global migration.
Yeah.
What about sort of the trends in other regional organizations to build up these regional free movement schemes, right? So sort of, I think ECOWAS, the Economic Community of Southwest African States. What about ASEAN, African Union? Do you know that they're?
Yeah, in Africa there are not only in ECOWAS. There's another one that I have forgotten now the name.
East Africa. Africa.
Yeah. They have as well free movement. There are also some agreements in the former Soviet Union, so between Russia and certain neighboring countries, and there is also to a lesser extent in Central America, in the Caribbean, but from what we know so far, and ASEAN is very, very limited. There's some discussion on visas for business movement, but not for movement of people. So the reason why I find South America interesting is that after the European Union is the most developed by far, even though in Africa there are disagreements, which the little I have read about them, they have many problems also in the implementation. So they are working, so. But that is also an interesting thing to realize, also for the point of view of the European Union, to realize that it's not only Europe which is thinking about opening borders and free movement of people, but it's also other regions in the world, or most regions in the world, which are also going in the same direction, with different peculiarities and different problems and different challenges and different speeds. But the trend is quite common in many regions. So I think that is also very important, because sometimes you hear in Europe these debates about, well, we're quite unique in doing this, and possibly that means that we are wrong somehow because no one else is doing it, but that's not true. Other regions are also moving in that direction.
Any other questions? I have another one, but I don't want to. I want to give you the opportunity. Yes.
I go back to the trade, let's say the union and alliances.
Yeah.
Because Mercosur and Pacific Alliance have conflicting interests on how they trade with the West and how they trade with the East. Right now, the economy has been looking towards the Pacific rather than towards the Atlantic. That is one of the main concerns of Mercosur. Taking into account that, how would it affect like a common currency? Because there has not been anything that has been put into force by UNASUR, because UNASUR hasn't been able to achieve any of the goals that have been proposed. So that's why let's say the Pacific Alliance report and Mercosur reform both have conflicting interests with the accession of Venezuela to Mercosur. That has represented a problem from them. In terms of the currency, of the unification of the currency, what do you think that will help or that will change the situation on the immigration side?
Well, if they will have a common currency.
Well, I don't, on my personal perspective, it is not possible. First of all, because of the economic situation in Venezuela, in Argentina. So other countries like Chile, like Brazil, wouldn't go to the rest of the island.
Yeah. I think there have been some discussions about a common currency, but at the level of ALBA, right? Rather than at the level of other,
The level of ALBA and Mercosur.
Mercosur as well, okay.
Not the Pacific Alliance. The minister hasn't been able to achieve.
Yeah, well, it's difficult to say. I think, as I said, there's a problem with so many different organizations having similar goals, because then at one point you need to decide on which organization is going to take the lead and which organization is going to have the ownership of the process, right? And that, I think, is a clear problem, not only with the Pacific Alliance, but also with the fact that we have also at the level of Andean communities and agreements on movement of people. Now UNASUR having as one of the goals, not only movement, but establishing a South American citizenship, without really saying what a South American citizenship means, what are your rights, who is included, and as I said, who has the ownership of that process, right? So I think it's one of the main problems, certainly, that there are too many conflicting actors playing a role, and that, as you said, the fact that they have different ideas on other aspects may make it harder to then negotiate a common agreement on movement of people. But so far the Mercosur Residence Agreement is working more or less. A lot of people is using it. Whether that is going to be deepened, as Argentina, for example, now Argentina, they are in the process of drafting a new agreement which will deepen the rights of mobility in the region and which will be open again to all South American countries, because it's not only the Mercosur ones, but all the other 7 countries are associate members to Mercosur, so they can also ratify these agreements. So that is why the Mercosur, I think, in my view, or UNASUR for that matter as well, they're in the best position to move forward this process, right? But as you say, UNASUR has not been very successful in moving forward any of the ideas. Of course, it's a very recent organization as well, right? So that's when we look at the history of the European Union, we also realize that, things have taken a lot of time. Sometimes we think that everything was quick in Europe, but it's not true actually.
And I mean, just to add to that, as somebody who knows the EU currency scheme and politics about it, is that, I mean, I foresee a lot of problems in implementing any sort of common currency in Latin America. I mean, if you think of, we had, even when the euro was created, we had these major conditions, right? That you cannot have more than 3% of government national budget deficit. Your country cannot have more than 6% of your GDP in national debt. And you have to have fairly low inflation, up to 2% roughly. I mean, now try to apply these to the various just the Mercosur countries, right? With Venezuela's inflation, let's say, hijacking, right? It would be running up all the time. And we still ended up in the euro crisis, right? So what I'm just saying, trying to say, I think definitely a single currency scheme in Latin America will be unlikely, I'd say, in the next, medium future. Of course, there's the other option that the Europeans initially also had that they didn't choose, is to have a supplementary currency, right? And that may be even slightly, for trade, for transnational movement, that may be slightly easier to handle in macroeconomic terms, but even then.
That was actually applied on Mercosur with the gaucho.
Okay. What's it called actually?
Gaucho.
Gaucho.
Okay.
It didn't work.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
Okay.
So they basically eliminated it. Any other questions? Then maybe can I ask one more? Okay, no, you wanted to ask.
Are there any nations that are largely opposed to the idea of
Free movement.
integration in South America? Or this is just, for example, maybe Chileans do not want Argentinians for any number of reasons, crime, ethnic divides, that sort of thing. Any main opponents, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there are some countries which are more in favor of the idea of regional integration than others. As I said, it changes depending on who is ruling in the country. So under Piñera, so basically in Chile we had Bachelet, Ricardo Lagos first, then Bachelet, then we had Piñera, who was center-right, and then we have again Bachelet, which is center-left, let's call it. And under Piñera, Chile was not as they were not so much in favor of free movement as, for example, under Bachelet. So Chile is one of the countries which perhaps is not as enthusiastic as other countries. The country that is leading the whole discussion is Argentina. That is very, very clear. And in that regard, Brazil is not as enthusiastic as Argentina. It's interesting that Argentina is leading the whole debate and discussion, because Argentina is actually the country with the largest percentage of non-nationals from the neighboring countries. So it has 4.5% of the population are from other South American countries. But still, they are the ones leading the debate and leading the discussion and the extension of rights and all that. The other countries, to be honest, they have very, very low percentage of migrants, even regional migrants. So we are talking about, Chile is less than 2%. Brazil is even less than 1%. They have, perhaps that is one of the reasons perhaps why there has not been so much negative discussion on free movement, because the extent of the movement is still very low in that regard. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, then my concluding question, let's say, so we all, about the EU-Latin American linkage. I mean, since the Migprosp, I guess, is also looking to Europe, were there any concrete attempts in transposing the model, right, transferring the model of EU free citizenship regime, point out some differences to Migprosp? Was there some sort of administrative twinning of personnel? Was there EU experts that were presenting, when you or others that were going down to kind of introduce
No, that's a very interesting question, because in South America there is the idea that migration law in general in Europe, and free movement of citizens as well, as included into this migration law idea, is very restrictive. So in South America, so I was, for example, quite shocked. I went once to Brasilia to present the Portuguese, Spanish immigration laws, comparing them with the Brazilian current immigration law and the proposal for a new immigration law in Brazil. And I divided my comparison in 6 categories, and all the Brazilians who were there from the government, they were all quite shocked to hear me saying that for each single category, Spain and Portugal were much more liberal than Brazil. They were saying, no, that's not possible, because you have the returns directive, and you have this idea of Fortress Europe, and you have all these migrants dying in the sea as they make their way to Europe, and certainly Europe has to be very restrictive. So in that regard, it's interesting, because Europe has been taken as a model not to follow. Okay, so whenever you do interviews with South Americans working on this, and you ask them, do you have any model? They never mention the European Union, which is quite interesting, right? That they don't, because I think it's part of this idea of Europe being very restrictive in terms of migration in general, which is not true, or not for every single legislation. Okay, Europe has a lot of different legislation on migration and on free movement. So it's interesting. No, actually they are not looking at the European Union. They look sometimes at international agreements, but they don't look at the European Union, or at least they always tell you that they're not looking at the European Union, right? And as to your question, whether there are some links, obviously now there are some links. There is a project between Europe and South America. It's financed, or Latin America actually, is financed by the European Commission, and they have been doing some work. It has been quite descriptive, basically describing what each country had in terms of migration law. So that's the reports that they have published. And there have been some exchanges between civil servants, between both regions, and within the framework of that project. But that's also quite a recent project. Yeah.
If there are no more questions, yes.
I came in a little bit late. Is Suriname and Guyana part of this whole process?
Yes, Suriname and Guyana, they are associate members to Mercosur, but they are not part of the Mercosur Residence Agreement yet. They could join if they wish to, but they are only associate members for the Mercosur since 2013. So I don't know if they will eventually join the agreement. They can do it, certainly, because being an associate member, you can also join the agreement. And obviously they are part of UNASUR, so under being part of UNASUR, they also they are included within this idea of South American citizenship, and they are also part of the South American Conference on Migration, which is this regional consultative process that is, they have these non-binding final declarations, but which has been very important in terms of reaching this consensus on how to deal with mobility or migration in the region. So they are there. Obviously, they are not important actors as other countries, but still there are some migrants from Suriname and Guyana in other neighboring countries, and also from, for example, from Brazil there. So it also goes in both ways in that regard. Sometimes it's interesting to see that there are actually Brazilians in countries where you will not expect to have many Brazilians, like Suriname, Guyana, or Paraguay, for example. There are many Brazilians in Paraguay as well. So they are part of the debate. Yeah.
If there are no more questions, then thank you very much.
Thank you.